The room was filled with a silence that didn't feel calm or peaceful. It felt like something inside reality had just cracked, and everyone present could sense it at the same time. At the edge of a narrow hospital bed stood the Pope, his white cassock slightly wrinkled from hours of moving through cold Vatican corridors. His posture was still, but his face told a different story. He was crying openly, without control, as if a truth he had been avoiding for a long time had finally become impossible to ignore. What he whispered next, through broken breath and barely formed words, would soon travel far beyond that room. Within hours, it would appear in headlines across multiple countries, but at that moment it was not history. It was simply a human reaction to something deeply unsettling. To understand why this moment mattered, the story has to move backward, because what happened here did not begin here. It began days earlier, in the quiet, controlled atmosphere of the Vatican under Pope Leo XIV, a man whose leadership had already started reshaping expectations within the Church. It was March 1st, 2026. The Vatican carried its usual structured discipline, but beneath that structure, there was a growing tension. In less than a year since his election, Pope Leo XIV had become a figure who disrupted the traditional calm of the institution, not through noise, but through action. His election itself had already been historic. On May 8, 2025, white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel, signaling a decision that shocked the world. The Church had chosen its first American Pope, Robert Francis Prevost, a 69-year-old Augustinian friar from Chicago. Yet his identity could not be understood only through nationality. Most of his life had been shaped far away from the United States, in northern Peru, where he worked among communities facing poverty, instability, and hardship. He often described his experience there in simple terms. The gospel, he said, does not begin with rituals or polished ceremonies. It begins with struggle, with exhaustion, with people who carry survival as part of daily life. Since becoming Pope, Leo XIV had not adopted a passive role. Instead, he moved quickly into structural changes within the Vatican. He reorganized major dicasteries, removed officials linked to long-ignored financial irregularities, and introduced strict financial accountability rules. One directive stood out clearly: no Vatican office should spend more on interior renovations than it allocates to charitable work. That single rule created discomfort within the institution. Some saw it as necessary reform, while others viewed it as unnecessary disruption. The internal hierarchy reacted with quiet resistance, but outside the Vatican walls, reactions were different. People who had long felt distant from the Church, especially the poor, immigrants, and marginalized communities, began to feel something unusual again: attention. Still, none of these reforms explained what was about to unfold on the morning of March 1st. There was no public announcement, no official schedule entry, no press briefing. Only one person inside the Pope's immediate circle knew about the early departure: Father Andres Valdivia, his private secretary, a quiet Peruvian priest who had worked with him since his time in Chiclayo. He understood a simple rule about the Pope. When he requested a car at 6 in the morning, it was not a request that required questions. It required execution. The destination was Casa Sant'Angelo, a residential care facility for elderly clergy located just outside the Leonine walls, about 20 minutes from St. Peter's Square. On paper, it was described as a stable, properly managed institution. It housed retired priests, aging nuns, and elderly members of religious life who had spent decades serving the Church. It had existed for years without controversy. Annual reports listed it as functional. Budget allocations were approved routinely. Administratively, it appeared to be operating as expected. But 3 weeks earlier, something arrived that disrupted that assumption. It was not an official report or complaint filed through church hierarchy. It was a handwritten letter. The author was an 84-year-old Franciscan nun named Sister Josefina Fina, who had spent over 60 years in service to the Church, the last 4 of them living in Casa Sant'Angelo. She did not expect the letter to reach the Pope. She did not even know if it would be read. But she wrote it anyway, because she believed that remaining silent would mean carrying the truth to her grave, without anyone ever hearing it. Father Valdivia discovered the letter in a stack of pre-sorted correspondence. He read it late at night in silence. By the next morning, it was on the Pope's desk without explanation. Leo XIV read it during breakfast, and after that, he did not speak for a long time. The letter described conditions inside Casa Sant'Angelo in simple but deeply troubling detail. Cold hallways where heating was unreliable. Meals served late in the afternoon that arrived already lukewarm. Staff members who were trying their best but were overwhelmed by workloads far beyond what was sustainable. She wrote about elderly priests who had dedicated their entire lives to missions, parishes, and service across the world, now spending their final years waiting for care that often came late or inconsistently. She described a man named Father Marco, an 88-year-old missionary, who sat each morning in his wheelchair, dressed and ready for Mass that only took place twice a week due to lack of available clergy. Her final words were especially heavy. She wrote that these people were not asking for luxury, they were asking not to be forgotten, and she feared that they already had been. Leo read the letter 3 times. On the third reading, he marked a single line with a pencil, a habit from his years teaching canon law in Peru. Then he made a decision without informing anyone in the Vatican administration. No Secretary of State, no communications office, no department heads, just a car at 6 a.m. and silence in the official schedule. When the morning arrived, Rome was still half asleep. The streets near the Vatican were nearly empty, filled only with early delivery trucks and cleaning vehicles moving through cobblestone roads. Inside the car, Pope Leo XIV sat quietly in the back seat, holding his breviary but not reading it. Father Valdivia watched him from the front seat, understanding that whatever was happening, it was not routine. As they crossed into the narrow road leading toward Casa Sant'Angelo, the city began to feel distant. The building itself appeared calm from the outside, a long structure with shuttered windows and iron balconies. It looked ordinary, almost peaceful, but the silence at the entrance felt different. The gate was unlocked, yet unattended. The intercom response took nearly 2 minutes. When it finally opened, no staff member came to greet them. And then, without announcement or ceremony, the Pope walked inside. The entrance of Casa Sant'Angelo did not match its reputation. On paper, it was described as a well-managed, dignified residence for retired clergy and elderly members of religious life. In reality, the first impression inside felt colder than expected, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. The floor tiles were clean but old, polished through repetition rather than care. The walls carried a faded institutional color, the kind chosen years ago and never truly updated. Near the entrance stood a plaster statue of the Virgin Mary, but the small votive candle beneath it had burned down completely and was never replaced. That detail, small as it was, carried a sense of neglect that no report could capture. A young nurse appeared from a side corridor just moments after they entered. She stopped instantly when she saw the white cassock. Her face lost color, not out of fear, but surprise mixed with disbelief. She was in her mid-20s, likely exhausted from long shifts that had become routine rather than exceptional. "Holy Father," she said, struggling to find words. We weren't told." The Pope did not respond with irritation or authority. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I know," he said. "I'd like to walk. You don't need to call anyone." That simple sentence changed the direction of the entire moment. There was no official visit being announced, no protocol being activated, no staff being summoned. It was just a man asking to see things as they are, without preparation. The nurse, unsure of what else to do, followed them. Partly because she felt responsible, partly because she seemed uncertain whether she was even allowed to do otherwise. As they walked, she introduced herself quietly. Her name was Elena. She had been working at Casa Sant'Angelo for 14 months. During that time, she had become one of only 3 nurses assigned to cover the morning shift for 63 residents. The number itself was not emphasized by the Pope, but it lingered in the air. 3 nurses for 63 elderly residents meant constant movement, constant urgency, and very little time for anything resembling proper attention. The corridor they entered was long and narrow, exactly as Sister Josefina had described in her letter. The lighting was fluorescent and slightly harsh, giving the space a washed-out, almost colorless appearance. Several doors were open, revealing glimpses of daily life that felt quiet but heavy. In one room, an elderly priest sat near a window, fully dressed but unshaven, staring at a garden he did not seem to be observing. His posture suggested waiting, but it was unclear for what. In another room, an elderly woman lay still in bed, her rosary resting on the pillow beside her. Her lips moved faintly, not clearly forming words, but indicating a habit of prayer that had become automatic over time. A third room revealed a priest who appeared to be sleeping, even though it was already past 7 in the morning. On the table beside him sat an untouched dinner tray from the previous night, still wrapped in plastic, waiting as if time itself had paused around it. The Pope stopped at that doorway. He looked at the tray, then at the man in the bed. He did not speak immediately. The silence in that moment was not empty. It was observant, as if he was absorbing details that others had stopped noticing. Elena finally spoke, her voice uneasy. The night staff was short. 2 people called in sick, sometimes the trays. "What is his name?" the Pope asked, cutting gently through her explanation. "Father Lorenzo," she replied. "He is 91. He was a missionary Congo, I think, for 30 years. The Pope stepped into the room. He moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with care. He placed a hand lightly on the elderly priest's arm. The man stirred, slowly opening his eyes. His expression carried confusion at first, the kind that comes with age and fatigue, when recognition does not arrive immediately. Then something shifted, not recognition of status, but recognition of presence. He realized someone was there with him, looking directly at him. "Gugioro, Padre," the Pope said softly. Father Lorenzo blinked. His voice was weak, almost fragile. "Are you the doctor?" "No," the Pope replied. "I'm just visiting." The old priest nodded slowly, accepting the answer without question, as if explanations were no longer something he expected from life. "Good," he said quietly. "It is good to have visitors." The simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than anything else in the room. It was not complaint or bitterness. It was acceptance shaped by long years of waiting for things that may or may not come. The Pope stayed a few moments longer. He made sure water was within reach, spoke a few soft words, then stepped back into the corridor. His expression remained controlled, but something had changed in his posture. His jaw was set differently now, not in anger but in decision. Father Valdivia noticed it immediately. It was the same expression he had seen before, in moments when the Pope stopped observing and began acting internally, even before any words were spoken. They continued upward. On the second floor they found Sister Josefina. She was seated in a common room with 2 other elderly nuns. All 3 had prayer books open in front of them, though none appeared to be actively reading. The room was quieter than the hallway, but not lighter. It carried a sense of long familiarity with waiting. Sister Josefina was small in frame, with white hair neatly covered by her veil. Her hands were folded carefully on the table, not out of formality, but habit, like someone trained by years of discipline to remain composed even in stillness. When she looked up and saw the man in white standing in the doorway, she did not react immediately. Instead, she studied him for several seconds, as if her mind was trying to determine whether what she was seeing was real or not. Then she slowly raised a hand to her mouth. Her eyes closed briefly. The Pope walked toward her table and sat down across from her. He did not remain standing. He lowered himself into a simple wooden chair so that they were at the same level. There was no distance between authority and resident, no physical symbol of hierarchy emphasized in that moment. "I received your letter," he said. Sister Josefina opened her eyes. They were filled with tears, but she did not cry dramatically. She had likely learned long ago how to hold emotion without letting it take control. "I was not sure it would reach you," she said quietly. "It reached me," the Pope replied. She looked at him for a long time before speaking again. "We are not ungrateful," she said. "These people, these priests, these sisters, they gave everything, their whole lives, and they are grateful." A pause followed. "But they are very cold," she added. and very alone. The word alone hung in the air longer than anything else she had said. And in that moment, the visit stopped being an inspection and became something far more personal. The word alone stayed in the room longer than anything else, Sister Josefina had said. It did not sound dramatic, and she did not repeat it for effect. But it carried a weight that filled the silence afterward, as if it had exposed something that had always been there, but never properly named. The Pope did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, absorbing not just her words, but the life behind them. Then, in a calm voice, he asked her if she would walk with him. Not as an order, not as a formal request, but as something simple and human. Sister Josefina nodded. She moved carefully, using a cane but with steady dignity. There was nothing fragile in her movement, even though her body showed age. It was the kind of strength that comes from a life spent enduring conditions rather than avoiding them. As she walked, she began showing him the building, not as a guide would, but as someone who had learned every corner through experience rather than design. She showed him the chapel first. It was small, clean, and well maintained. Compared to the rest of the building, it stood out immediately. The lighting was warmer, the air slightly more cared for, and fresh flowers were placed near the altar. The Pope noticed it quietly. He did not comment on the beauty of the chapel. Instead, his eyes shifted toward what was missing elsewhere. The contrast was subtle but clear. A space meant for spiritual care had been preserved carefully, while the living spaces of the residents showed signs of strain. They moved on. She showed him the corridors, the rooms, the shared spaces where residents spent most of their time. The difference between the chapel and these areas was not extreme neglect, but quiet inconsistency. Some things were maintained, others were simply managed. They reached the kitchen. Inside, a middle-aged cook greeted them with visible discomfort. He had worked there for over a decade. His expression carried the kind of tired responsibility that comes from doing one's best in conditions that never fully improve. He explained, almost apologetically, that meals were being prepared for 63 residents on a budget that had not changed in 6 years. Prices had increased, supplies had become harder to manage, and staffing had not grown. He also mentioned the heating system in the East Wing. It had been reported broken in November. Now it was March. The sentence hung in the air without need for commentary. November to March. The Pope turned slightly toward Father Valdivia. "Write that down," he said. Not loudly, not emotionally, but with a clarity that made it clear it mattered. They continued walking. The visit extended beyond observation, it became presence. The Pope sat with residents, not in a ceremonial way, but in a quiet, attentive manner. He listened to stories that stretched across continents, missions in Africa, service in South America, years spent in remote parishes where comfort had never been part of the calling. An elderly Jesuit spoke about Bolivia in the 1970s, about mining towns, about celebrating Mass in places where survival itself was uncertain. He spoke not with complaint, but with memory. The Pope listened carefully, and as he listened, a thought formed quietly in his mind, not spoken but deeply present. These people carried the Church for decades, through their youth, their strength, their health, and now, in their final years, many of them were waiting in silence in cold rooms for basic care. That realization did not come as anger first. It came as weight, the kind of weight that slowly turns into responsibility. By the time they reached the afternoon, Elena, the nurse, was no longer pale or uncertain. Her expression had changed. She was still overwhelmed, but now for a different reason. Something in the atmosphere of the building had shifted. She had expected confusion, maybe even criticism. Instead, she had seen something she was not used to seeing in this environment: attention without distance. When the Pope prepared to leave, he did not leave quietly in the sense of disappearing. He left after acknowledging people. He thanked Elena directly. He thanked the cook. He acknowledged the other staff members who had arrived during the visit. He shook hands with each of them, looking them in the eye as he spoke. He told them very simply that what they were doing mattered more than they had been told, not as encouragement, as fact. By the time the car left Casa Sant'Angelo, Something had already changed, even though no official announcement had been made yet. The visit had not been scheduled, recorded, or framed within institutional language, but its impact was already moving through people. By noon, phone calls began inside the Vatican. The first call came from the papal apartment to Cardinal Eduardo Bertoni, head of the dicastery for clergy. He answered with the calm caution of someone experienced in Vatican administration, already sensing that this was not a routine update. The Pope spoke without raising his voice. He explained what he had seen. Broken heating since November, 3 nurses for 63 residents, delayed care, and elderly priests left in conditions that did not reflect their service. He did not ask for opinions, he gave instructions. A full operational and financial audit of Casa Sant'Angelo within 30 days. Immediate emergency staffing adjustments. Heating repair within the week. Budget review for meals without delay. Cardinal Bertoni attempted to respond in procedural language, but the Pope interrupted him gently, cutting through structure without hostility. "I'm not asking how things are normally handled," he said. "I'm telling you what will happen." There was a pause on the line. Then, quietly, the response came. "Of course, Holy Father." A second call followed. This time to Vatican administrative offices overseeing elderly care budgets across multiple facilities, not just Casa Sant'Angelo, but several similar institutions. The Pope requested 5 years of financial records. He asked for comparisons between spending on infrastructure and spending on direct care. He asked for everything to be presented in writing. The emphasis on writing was deliberate. He wanted numbers that could not be softened by explanation. The third call went to communications. He instructed them that he would speak publicly about the care of elderly clergy, not through a prepared document, not through a formal encyclical, but through a direct recorded statement. He made one thing clear: no editing for tone. The message would be delivered exactly as spoken. The Vatican rarely moves quickly unless it is forced to. It is an institution built on procedure, where decisions are filtered through layers of offices, approvals, and historical precedent. But after the calls made on the morning following Casa Sant'Angelo, something unusual began to happen, not publicly, not loudly, but internally, where the system quietly adjusts itself when it realizes delay is no longer an option. By the afternoon of March 2nd, the requested audits had already begun to take shape. Offices that normally take weeks to coordinate were now exchanging documents within hours. Staff who were used to long timelines were suddenly working against immediate deadlines. It was not panic, but it was urgency, and in the Vatican, urgency itself is rare. But the most significant change was still to come. That same afternoon, Pope Leo XIV recorded a public statement. It was not done in the Apostolic Palace's grand halls, nor in a ceremonial setting designed for global attention. Instead, it was recorded in a small, quiet room near the Vatican Library. There was no podium, no decorative background, no symbolic framing of authority, just a chair, a camera, an operator, and Father Valdivia standing silently nearby. The simplicity of the setting mattered. It removed distance between speaker and viewer. The Pope sat down without ceremony. He did not adjust himself for presentation. He did not begin with formal greetings. He simply started speaking. He spoke for 16 minutes. What he said cannot be reduced to a single emotional moment or a single phrase, because the impact was not only in the words, it was also in the pauses. In the moments where he stopped briefly, not because he lacked language, but because he was choosing whether to continue. He began by referencing Scripture. Leviticus 19:32, rise in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly. He did not present it as symbolic guidance. He presented it as instruction, clear, direct, and binding in meaning. The care of the elderly, he said, was not optional within the life of the Church. It was foundational. Then he moved into a broader reflection on the Church's history. He acknowledged its achievements without hesitation: hospitals built, schools established, orphanages supported across centuries. These, he said, were real and important acts of service. But then his tone shifted slightly, because alongside those achievements, he said, something quieter had developed over time. a habit not intentional but persistent of prioritizing systems over individuals. He described it carefully. We maintain the buildings, he said. We file the reports. We approve the budgets. And we tell ourselves that this means care is happening. A pause followed. It does not. He explained that a warm chapel does not balance out a cold bedroom, that a well-maintained administrative report does not equal a well-treated person, that paperwork can exist perfectly while human need is still unmet. He did not raise his voice. That was not necessary. The clarity itself carried the weight. Then he shifted into personal testimony. He spoke about a visit he had made the previous morning. He did not name the facility. That was intentional. The issue, he explained, was not one location. It was a pattern. He described elderly men and women who had spent their entire lives in service, missionaries, priests, sisters, people who had dedicated decades to faith and community. And yet, in their final years, many were waiting for meals, waiting for warmth, waiting for attention that should not require asking. He paused again. Then he spoke about a man he had met, a 91-year-old priest who had served in Congo for decades. A man who had been asked in his final years whether he was a doctor when the Pope entered his room. That detail, simple as it was, carried a deeper meaning, not recognition of authority, but recognition of absence. A life so distant from attention that even basic identification had become uncertain. The Pope's voice changed slightly here, not emotionally dramatic, but quieter, more concentrated. He said that moment stayed with him because it revealed something uncomfortable, that dignity can erode not through cruelty, but through neglect. He did not accuse individuals. He did not assign blame to a single person or office. Instead, he described layers, systems, routines, approvals that gradually replaced direct human awareness. And then he stated the central point clearly. The Church does not exist to maintain itself, he said. It exists to love. He explained what that love actually means in practice. Not abstract care, not symbolic gestures, but presence, sitting with people, asking how they are, making sure they are warm, making sure they are not forgotten. He emphasized that the elderly are not a burden to be managed. They are memory, they are continuity, they are the people who carried the Church forward through decades of unseen labor. And then he delivered the part that would later circulate globally. He called on every diocese, every religious order, every institution operating elderly care facilities to physically inspect them, not through reports, but in person. Walk the corridors. Speak to residents. Ask staff how many people they are responsible for. Check heating systems. Check meal conditions. Check when Mass was last celebrated regularly. And if those answers created discomfort, he said, that discomfort should not be avoided. It should be held. Because discomfort, he suggested, is often the beginning of correction. He then outlined immediate administrative steps: emergency reviews of Vatican-run facilities, formation of oversight groups, and inclusion of elderly residents in feedback structures that had previously excluded them. The idea was simple but significant. People living in these conditions should have a voice in evaluating them. He ended without rhetorical flourish. I see you, he said to the elderly clergy watching or listening, not as categories, not as entries in a budget. I see you. And I ask forgiveness for every moment you were made invisible. The recording ended. There was no dramatic closing music, no staged conclusion, just silence after the camera stopped. But outside that room, the impact was immediate. Within hours, the Vatican released the statement publicly. Leo XIV reviewed the edited version and removed 2 softening adjustments suggested by staff. He insisted the original tone remain intact. By the next morning, the full 16-minute recording was circulating globally. Millions of views, multiple languages, headlines across continents. Some focused on the reforms. Others focused on the emotional weight. Many focused on the visible restraint in his voice, the way he did not perform emotion, but allowed silence to carry meaning. And inside Casa Sant'Angelo, change had already begun. Maintenance crews arrived early. Heating systems were repaired in the East Wing. Temporary nursing support was deployed. Budget revisions were initiated. But perhaps the most important change was quieter. The residents were no longer being treated as invisible, and for many of them, that shift mattered more than anything else. By the morning of March 3rd, the world was already reacting faster than the Vatican had expected. The recorded statement from Pope Leo XIV had crossed language barriers within hours. Italian, Spanish, French, English, German, Portuguese, Polish, and Tagalog headlines all carried the same central idea in different forms. Something had shifted inside the Church's voice. But behind the global attention, inside Casa Sant'Angelo, the change was not happening through headlines. It was happening through small, visible corrections to everyday life. Maintenance workers arrived early in the morning, not in a symbolic way, not for inspection photos, but with tools and instructions. The heating system in the East Wing, which had been broken since November, was finally repaired. For the first time in months, rooms began to warm properly. Residents noticed it quietly, without ceremony, but with clear relief. Temporary nursing staff were assigned within hours. The same corridors that had once felt understaffed and rushed now had more presence, more attention, and more time per resident. Meals, which had previously arrived late or cold, were now served properly heated. None of these changes were extraordinary in themselves, but together they marked a visible correction of conditions that had been accepted for too long. Inside the common rooms, the atmosphere began to shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but in a way that long-term residents could feel. Things that had been ignored for months were suddenly being noticed. Things that had been tolerated were now being addressed. Sister Josefina observed these changes quietly. She did not celebrate them loudly or treat them as a victory. Instead, she watched with a calm understanding of someone who had not been asking for miracles, only attention. When Elena, the nurse, showed her the recording of the Pope's statement on a tablet the next morning, Sister Josefina listened without interruption. Her expression remained steady throughout the 16 minutes. When it ended, she sat still for a long time. Then she spoke softly. He kept the important part. Elena asked her what she meant. Sister Josefina did not look away from the screen. The part about Father Lorenzo, she said. He did not change it. He did not make it easier. He kept it exactly as it was. She paused briefly, as if confirming her own thought. That is how you know someone means what they say. Meanwhile, Father Lorenzo himself learned of the Pope's visit in a simple way. He was told that a high-ranking visitor had come to see him, and that his name had been mentioned publicly. He listened carefully, asking a few questions, trying to understand the details without confusion. When the explanation ended, he remained quiet for a moment. Then he spoke with the calm simplicity of someone whose entire life had already taught him what matters and what does not. "I thought he was the doctor," he said gently. A pause followed. But he was kind. He adjusted his rosary in his hands. A kind man is good company. Doctor or not, there was no analysis in his words, no institutional interpretation. Just a personal conclusion shaped by experience rather than status. Outside his window, Rome was beginning to shift into the softer light of early spring. The cold edge of winter was still present in the air, but it was loosening. The kind of light that arrives in March carries hesitation. It suggests warmth without fully delivering it yet. But inside Casa Sant'Angelo, something more immediate had changed. The heating worked, dinner arrived warm, staff were more present. Residents were no longer being treated as background to an administrative system. And while none of these changes erased what had come before, they altered what came next. Back in the Vatican, internal reviews continued. Financial records across multiple elderly care facilities were being compared, documented, and analyzed. The numbers told a story that many within the administration had not fully confronted before, not of intentional neglect, but of gradual imbalance, where efficiency had slowly replaced attention. The Pope did not comment publicly on the follow-up steps. He did not turn the moment into a continuing campaign. Instead, he allowed the system to respond under the pressure of what had already been revealed. But for those who had been at Casa Sant'Angelo, the impact of that visit remained something different from policy or reform. It was memory, the memory of being seen without preparation. The memory of a leader sitting down at eye level instead of standing above. The memory of a question asked not for information, but for understanding. And perhaps most importantly, the memory of a simple truth being stated clearly in a place that had grown used to silence. That dignity is not maintained through structure alone. It is maintained through presence. And when presence disappears, no system, no matter how organized, can fully replace it. As March moved forward, the story continued to spread, but its core did not change. People did not remember the details of budgets or administrative instructions as much as they remembered the image of an elderly priest being asked his name and the response that followed, not with recognition of power, but with recognition of kindness. Because in the end, that is what stayed with them. Not authority, not reform, but attention. And for many inside Casa Sant'Angelo, that was the first time in a long while they felt like they were no longer invisible.